Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Ali and I'm a junior doctor working in Cambridge, and I've just had my very first long day shift, and this is going to be a video where I just talk about it, and I don't really know what I'm going to say. I'm just going to freestyle this. We'll see how it ends up. But I think this is the sort of video that I would have really appreciated back when I was A, applying to medicine, and B, a medical student, because I think hopefully it'll be just kind of a raw look at what being a doctor is actually like, because often, and this was definitely the case for me and most people in my year, this idea of becoming a doctor is much more glamorous than actually being a doctor. But having said that, today was quite fun. So the way it works at my hospital is that when we have a long day, that lasts from 8:30 in the morning to about 9:30 in the evening. And up until about 6 p.m, we're just doing our general day-to-day ward duties. So I'm on the cardiology ward as my first placement. So that involves going on the ward round with the team in the morning, and then as jobs come up, I go off to the doctor's office and do the jobs. So often that's stuff like writing a discharge summary so a patient can go home, or writing a transfer letter so we can transfer them to the adjacent cardiothoracic hospital. Occasionally it's also stuff like, for example, if we've got a patient who's got some interesting infection that we're not quite sure how to treat, we would discuss with the infectious diseases team. Or if we've got a patient who's on insulin, who's diabetic, and we're not quite sure what's happening with their insulin, we might contact the diabetic team about that. And there's loads of different teams in the hospital that all specialize in their own little stuff. So as the cardiology team, our specialty is obviously the heart. And when it comes to other stuff that's kind of beyond our remit as heart doctors, even though we've all kind of come across this stuff in medical school, even so, we still want to discuss it with the team that's been dealing with it for their whole lives. So that's a big part of the job, doing referrals to other teams. And actually on that note, I remember a few days ago, I tried making a referral to the vascular surgery team. Now, making a referral is a really kind of stressful, stress-inducing experience, or it can be, because what you have to do when making a referral is that you have to phone up a registrar who is a medic who's 5 or 6 years older than you are probably, and you have to try and kind of sell the story to them. You've got to make them think that it's worth their time to see your patient, as to, why it's relevant to them. So we had a patient who had some problems with ischemia, which is lack of blood supply to his legs, and I called the vascular surgeon, the vascular surgery registrar, asking him if he could review the patient. And then this registrar just started asking me lots of questions. He was like, okay, is the patient a smoker? I was like, oh, I don't know. He was like, okay, well, what signs of ischemia of his leg does he have? I was like, that's a good question, I don't know. He was like, has he got any vascular risk factors? I don't know. He even asked, why is the patient in hospital? And because I hadn't read through the notes in depth, I actually didn't quite know how to explain why the patient was in hospital. Initially, I just thought you'd pick up the phone and say, hey, you're vascular surgery, can you review this guy? He's got an ischemic leg. That's, a vascular surgical problem, isn't it? But actually I realized that after this call, and after getting absolutely destroyed over the phone, that, you kind of do need to prepare when making a referral. They're a doctor with loads of experience, or a lot older than you are, and you need to tell them exactly why you're calling them and exactly what you're asking for. But since then, I've made lots of other referrals, and it's gone less badly because now I spend a lot of time preparing my spiel for what I'm going to say. So for example, this is a 71-year-old gentleman who's in hospital because of infective endocarditis. The reason I'm calling you specifically is because we've grown this bacteria in his blood cultures, and we're not quite sure of what antibiotic choice. As the microbiology registrar, or as the infectious diseases registrar, what would you recommend, given that we've already done this? So you're asking them a very, very specific question based on a clinical picture, and then they can, they're much more nice when they're, replying to you and giving you advice. So that's another big part of the job. So yeah, in general, that's pretty much what an F1 does. You go on the ward round, you see the patients, and then you go off and do the jobs. And at my hospital in Cambridge, because it's an entirely electronic system, a lot of the general admin that other doctors around the UK have to do, we pretty much don't have to do. Because let's say we get a call and we're in a different office about prescribing a certain drug, and we know the patient and we know we can prescribe it, we can just type in a few things on the system and it automatically gets prescribed, rather than having to go all the way to the ward, write it by hand on a drug chart and do all that stuff. So a lot of the day-to-day admin things like giving drugs, requesting x-rays, requesting blood tests, all of this stuff can be managed from just a computer. So you have a lot more power, and once you get the hang of using this computer system, stuff becomes a lot more efficient. At least that's what people say. I've only been using it for the past few days and already I love it. Anyway, so this is what happened between 8:30 in the morning and 6 p.m. at night in the evening. But then from 6 till 9, that's when we get 4 of the F1s, the Foundation Year 1 doctors, to kind of cover basically all of the medical wards in the hospital for those 3 hours. So between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m, we pretty much just have to make sure that all of the medical patients survive and nothing overly bad happens to them in those 3 hours. Because then when it gets to 9 p.m, we can hand over to the night team, which are more experienced doctors who then manage the whole hospital for the rest of the night. So today, I had my first one of these evening shifts, and from about 5:30 onwards, I started getting calls from various wards. So I was covering the cardiology ward, the respiratory ward, and the gastroenterology ward. So I started getting calls from those day teams handing over patients that they wanted me to look at overnight. So there were a few patients on the gastro ward who were going to have CT scans overnight, and my job was to just review the CT scan as and when it arrived and make sure there was nothing overly bad on it that might be an emergency that we might have to act on in the moment. I got some calls from the renal ward who were again handing over patients who needed to have their bloods checked because they were having some blood tests, and again, if one of the bloods came back with a really low pH, then I'd have to act on it, or a really high lactate, then I'd have to act on it. So it's stuff like that, sort of things left over from the day team that can't really wait until the following morning. And this is a big debate that happens in hospitals and around teams, is that to what extent should you hand stuff over to the night team? Because let's say it's like a random blood test where the results of it won't change anything like there and then. That's probably not the kind of thing that you'd want the nighttime doctor to review, because the nighttime doctor is covering so many different wards, and the nighttime doctor is pretty much just there to make sure everyone survives the night. So only genuinely urgent or emergency things should ideally be handed over to them. So I managed to get through these. This was probably the first time, while I was on this late shift, that I felt like I was, in a way, a real doctor, because for the last week or so, I've been on the cardiology ward. I've been the most junior person on the ward, and all the decisions have been being made by the consultants, by the registrars, and I'm the one just kind of making them happen by typing into the system or whatever. And that's great because I have zero experience in cardiology. They're the experts. We're taking care of really sick patients, and my hospital in Cambridge is a tertiary centre, so we take in the most complicated patients from all around the region. So obviously that's beyond my expertise as fresh out of medical school for about a week. But when I was on this late shift, that's when we all, the four of us who were on it, had a lot more responsibility. So I got a call asking me to prescribe some warfarin for a patient, and I didn't, I suppose I could have called the cardiology registrar or the medical registrar, but at that point I'd done it a few times, I'd seen it done, and therefore I felt comfortable to make the decision for myself as to what drug this patient could have. I also got called to prescribe some painkillers for someone else, which wasn't overly tough. But then there was a patient who needed to have a blood transfusion because their hemoglobin levels were down, they were anemic. And I got called to prescribe the blood transfusion, to kind of write out the form. And blood transfusions can be a little bit scary to prescribe because you always have the risk whenever you're transfusing anyone that they'll have a transfusion reaction. So ideally, they wouldn't have, for example, if you're familiar with blood types, there's A, B, and O. And if you give the wrong blood type to a patient, then the chances are quite high that they will die, because ABO incompatibility reactions are really, really, really bad, because your whole immune system targets that blood, and then it'll you get a massive inflammatory response, and it's just not good. So there's loads of different checks in place to stop people from getting ABO incompatibility. So for example, you have to take 2 different blood samples from 2 different places and double check them each time, and check the patient's details against the blood 4 times, just to make sure this sort of thing never happens. In addition to that, however, there are also other reactions that people can have to transfuse blood. So you can get people still getting an anaphylactic reaction to transfuse blood, even if the ABO blood type matches, because of these things called minor antigens. Anyway, the point is, blood transfusion is never 100% safe, and therefore it's always a little bit of a scary thing when you're prescribing someone blood, because you run the risk that, however small it is, that they could have a reaction. So it was my job to review the patient's note, to go talk to the patient, talk to their family, work out if they'd ever had any reactions to transfusions in the past, and then ultimately sign my name against this thing and say, I'm happy for this patient to be given 2 units of red blood cells. So that was interesting, that was quite scary. And then there was another sort of scary moment where I was called because one of the patients on the gastro ward was having severe nausea, and he'd been having this problem for ages, and I was talking to him, and he got quite tearful naturally, because nausea is one of the most terrible, arguably nausea is even worse than pain, as one of our palliative care consultants once said, because pain you can kind of deal with, but nausea is just such a debilitating feeling, and this guy had been suffering with it for the last 5 weeks, and no one really knew what was going on. He was in for investigations, so he was on 2 antiemetics, anti-sickness drugs, and the nurse had called me asking me to prescribe a 3rd because it just wasn't really, the drugs he was on weren't really helping him. But the problem is that Antiemetics are quite complicated, can be complex drugs. There's like 6 or 7 different types. They all act in slightly different ways, and they all have slightly different effects. In that, let's say your sickness is caused by morphine or chemotherapy, then one type of antiemetic agent would be useful. Let's say it's caused because you've got some electrolyte abnormality in your blood, then another type of anti-sickness agent. Let's say it's caused because you've got some abdominal issue, a third type of anti-sickness medication would be useful. And these decisions of what sort of anti-sickness drugs to give to patients can be very complex. And it's not really the sort of thing that I, as the nighttime emergency on-call doctor, can be making, because they require a long conversation with the patient, looking at their entire history, looking at all the drugs that they're on, trying to work out why this is happening in the first place. It's not really the remit of the nighttime staff. It's more the remit of the people that are looking after the patient during the daytime. Anyway, so this patient calls, I get called to this patient, and the patient is quite tearful naturally, and he's unable to get to sleep for the last 2 days because of this sickness. And I wasn't really sure what to do. So thankfully, this is why you can always call a senior. So I used an app on my phone where I looked up the number for the palliative care specialist. This patient wasn't a palliative patient, but palliative care specialist doctors are experts at prescribing anti-sickness medication, because in their last weeks of life, palliative care patients often are on anti-sickness drugs to combat the nausea that they can feel. So I called up this doctor, and she was really nice over the phone. She asked me the history of the patient. I explained what I knew, and she kind of admitted, she was like, so it sounds like this is quite a complicated patient. He had a really complicated history, and it sounds like you're not really equipped to be making this complicated decision about his drug anti-sickness management in the next 10 minutes because you're the nighttime doctor. And I was like, yeah, that was my thought exactly. And then we kind of had a discussion about this, and she explained that, okay, so maybe what you're going to have to do is kind of explain to the patient nicely that you're very sorry that you can't change his medication, and you hope that the team in the morning will be able to help with that. So that's what I did. I went into his room, I sat down, I did the whole communication skill thing, and found out his concerns, and found out that he was having difficulty sleeping, and ended up prescribing a sleeping tablet for him and gave him a little bit of morphine for the pain. But ultimately explained to him that I can't be making a decision about what sort of anti-sickness drug to give him, because it's such a complex affair, and there's no hope of getting it right in 10 minutes at nighttime. Anyway, so that was quite challenging. So once I've handled all of that, by this point it's about 8 p.m. and I've got an hour left in my shift. And at this point, I don't really have anything urgent that needs doing. I've got a few patients on my list, so like every time I get bleeped with a job, I write it on my iPad Pro in a encrypted document without any patient identifiable information, just like numbers and initials of like things that I need to do. And I've got a list of things that I need to chase. So at this point, I'm feeling quite hungry, so I pop down to Costa, I grab a cheeky latte, and then I take a seat in the Cambridge Heart Clinic, which is a really beautiful, air-conditioned, really nice kind of ward space where the cardiology doctors sometimes hang out. And I found like a nice little chair logged into the computer, and because the whole hospital is electronic, I managed to find out the results of all the investigations that I had to do from this really nice room. And then, just got a few bleeps every now and then to prescribe painkillers, to prescribe warfarin, and that was absolutely fine. And then about 3 minutes, it was about 8:57, like 3 minutes before I was due to hand over to the nighttime team, I got a bleep from one of the nurses who was calling me to a patient because they had a fever, they had a high heart rate, they had a low blood pressure, their respiratory rate was high. And there's this thing called the National Early Warning Score, the NEWS, which is kind of like a numerical way of very quickly assessing how sick someone is. So let's say you have a heart rate of above 100, that would give you a few points on the score. Let's say you have a blood pressure below a certain number, you'd have a certain points on the score. So this guy had a NEWS score of 12, which is really, really high. And effectively, the higher the score is, the more worried you should be about the patient. And this is something nurses are very good at. They calculate the NEWS score, and then if it's above a certain threshold, they just call the doctor and say, okay, we've got a NEWS score of 12. These are the parameters, this is the temperature, blood pressure, this is the history, can you please come and see the patient? So I got to the patient. Thankfully, the rapid response team was already there, and that's something that quite a few hospitals have now. They're a team of really experienced nurses and intensive care doctors whose job it is to just kind of be on call for anyone who is acutely unwell. So the nurse had very kindly called the rapid response team, and 2 of the rapid response nurses arrived, and they were absolutely incredible. They were just so calm under pressure. The patient was deteriorating, but they just got him straight under control. Just like, speaking in fairly low, fairly kind of quiet voices because it was nighttime and other patients were asleep, but they just handled it so calmly. And I was just kind of standing there being like, okay, right, what can I do? I was looking on the computer, looking what the history of the patient was, using my stethoscope to listen to the heart and lungs. And I listened to the heart and lungs, didn't find out anything that was particularly useful, but these rapid response guys really knew what they were doing. And that was such an inspiring way of kind of seeing how they dealt with it, because we have had the kind of seminars and classes and simulations on dealing with acutely unwell patients, but it's very different doing it on a simulated patient versus doing it in real life. And we have also had training from these rapid response nurses, and like, I think just kind of the more experience we get with this, the better we'll be at doing it. So it was really nice having them there as kind of a backup, but they ended up being less of a backup and I was more of the backup. They were just doing stuff and explaining stuff as they went along and being really nice to me, and it was great. Like, I think they could tell that this was my first time kind of doing a night shift and dealing with an acutely unwell patient, and they just handled it absolutely perfectly. So yeah, absolutely love the rapid response team. So that was what the night was like. And then it was time to hand over. After this patient was stabilized, it was time to hand over to the night team. And when I got to the boardroom where this handover happens, I found out actually that the guy I was handing over to is a guy that was in my college at Cambridge, like 3 years older than me, and he supervised some of my friends. So we got to know each other. He's into photography as well, so we got chatting a bit about the new Sony A7 III camera, handed over the patients that needed checking up. Found out that one of the other doctors who was taking over from one of the other F1s was again a medical student at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, who supervised me in neuro when I was in second year. She was like 2-3 years above us as well. So it was just like really nice. Like it was almost like a little sort of family reunion. They're like, oh, hello, this person, hello, that person. Like I recognize you, I know who you are. Then me is like a little bit of chit chat, and that was just like a really nice end to the day, seeing these guys and kind of realizing that, oh, these guys are actual doctors now, they're core medical trainees, they know what they're doing, they're taking over from me. It was just like a really pleasant experience. So overall, first day doing like a twilight shift, 13 hours. It didn't really feel like 13 hours because when you're doing stuff, the time just absolutely flies. You're doing a discharge summary and then you've got another job, you've got a bleep coming in, and then the next thing you know, like 3 hours have passed and you're like, oh wow, it's like lunchtime already. And then after lunch, there's like stuff to do and you're like, oh wow, it's 6 p.m. already. And then even on this late shift when I was dealing with all these bleeps that were coming through every now and then, writing them on my little iPad, like crossing them off when they were done, the time just absolutely flew. And there was never a moment where I was bored. And that's always been my biggest worry with doing medicine, is that, you know, this in the back of my head, that what if I don't enjoy it? And so far, it's been a few days on the job. I think I do enjoy it. It's obviously not all kind of fun and games. It's not all roses. There is, as an F1, there is a lot of admin that you have to do. There's a lot of writing discharge letters. There's a lot of kind of dealing with paperwork or electronic paperwork. But even so, I kind of realized today, especially in this evening shift where I got to make some decisions, that actually, yeah, I do sort of vaguely know what I'm doing. And when I don't, as was in the case of the acutely unwell patient, as was in the case of this anti-sickness thing, there are always other people you can contact for help, either the rapid response team or your senior registrars or even the consultants. There's this kind of chain of command that if you don't know what to do, as soon as you get stuck, you just escalate it. That's a really nice kind of safety net that's in place for the patients and also for us. So, really good day. This has been a very rambly video. Let me know what you think of the format. If you're still watching, then thank you very much for watching. I hope you liked the video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so. Have a lovely day, and I'll see you in the next video, the next vlog about life as a junior doctor. Good night.